It's wonderful to have Tony here. So I'll just introduce Tony briefly. He's the chair of Australian literature at UWA, and his books include Like Nothing on This Earth, which won the Walter McRae Russell Prize for Australian Literary Scholarship, and Paper Nation, which won the Ernest Scott and W.H. Hancock Prizes for Australian History. And Tony's paper today is titled The Anthropocene Limit, Recent Australian Ecofiction. Thank you, Tony.
No worries. I'll just try and share my screen. Hang on. Did that work?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if I can move this thing around. Oh, yeah. All right, good. I'm coming from Whadjuk Noongar country in Perth, from my home. And I also pay my respects to the custodians of this land, and on which I'm giving this paper. Now, I apologize for anyone who may have kind of tuned into me at the ASIL conference, because there'll be some overlap with this one, but I mean, the slight advantage of this is that it's a little bit more relaxed format, a little bit more time, and I can just move through it a bit quicker than the 20-minute papers, 3 in a session, kind of compressed circumstances that we normally have at a conference. So it's really nice. It's really nice actually to put faces to names. I know a lot of you by name, admire your work. So it's really just nice to see you all, and it's kind of one of the perverse, I guess, opportunities that the whole COVID emergency has kind of created, actually, particularly for someone like myself who lives in Western Australia and has to move across the continent usually in the old days. Anyway, thanks a lot, Emily, and to your group for inviting me and for hosting me today. So the theme of the ASIL conference was limit, and I kind of used that concept. Well, it helped clarify something in the way I've been thinking about, I guess, contemporary Anthropocene or ecological fiction in Australia. I'd also contributed a chapter, I don't think it's been published yet, but to I guess I think it was the companion to the Australian novel, edited by Nicholas Burns, and it was kind of asking me to think about this kind of concept. So that's the origins of how I've come to this. I've kept a sort of a weather eye on Australian fiction of an ecological nature. I think I've probably really turned onto it. It's kind of quite a foundational sort of novel for me was Julia Lee's The Hunter. When I read that, it seemed to announce a new kind of sensibility and a new kind of apprehension of kind of extinction and finality that was very bracing, I think, for me when I encountered it towards the end of my postgraduate study. So that's kind of that. And you'll see the shadow of that book maybe in some of the things I've got to say. Okay. So thinking in terms of the Anthropocene as a limit, I mean, it's often kind of cast as a limit. And I was led to the speculation that maybe Anthropocene is not just a limit, but kind of is our way in this contemporary moment of speaking to the idea of limit as such. So the Anthropocene represents kind of a limit point in its pure or ultimate kind of form. So you can see that in some of the ways that it gets framed by kind of theorists. So Chakrabarty's essay on the climate of history, it talks about, you know, the Anthropocene being a moment where humans become kind of conscious that the background is not stable. What he calls the parametric conditions of life are not solid, are kind of in a certain kind of flux, and we're the cause of that. Another influential formulation is Timothy Morton's idea of a hyperobject, and he regards global warming as a hyperobject. He's got, again, that's a general category, not just confined to global warming, but lots of things that are too big to think about, I guess, is probably the sort of dumb way of expressing it. So objects which resist all attempts to localize their intelligibility within sort of stable forms, like he gives other examples like the Civil War. So things that are too big to think about, kind of hyper objects. You might have better takes on it than me. The English eco-critic Timothy Clark regards the Anthropocene as a threshold concept, a break in consciousness and understanding. So you can see in all of these kind of influential formulations that there is the idea of the Anthropocene is treated as a kind of a limit point. But then I'm thinking about it a little bit more. I mean, limits have this important ambiguity to them. So on the one hand, they represent a point beyond which we cannot go, kind of horizon, I guess. Yet we tend to only apprehend, often we only apprehend the limit at the moment it gets exceeded. So there's a kind of, again, there's a sort of a paradox there, I think. And it led me to posit the idea that I'll try and tease this out so it doesn't sound quite so naked and gnomic, that we experience the limit of a limit as an excess. So I'll talk about what I mean by kind of the excessive quality of the Anthropocene as we go along. The question then is, like, within the fields of representation, like, how do we represent a limit? You know, a limit to representation. How do we represent the limits of representation? So we can also think of limit as a sort of a tear, like a tear in reality. But that's probably, you know, that's kind of shows the era that I was born into, really, kind of an image that's redolent of print. The particular conjunction that we have now of the Anthropocene with the digital age seems to have caused people to represent or to find a kind of I guess a acknowledgement of limit within the concept of the glitch. So, like, there's a TV show called Glitch, and in that, like, people come back to life. They sort of rise, the dead rise out of the graveyard. But when they rise, they're not like decayed, rotting corpses like zombies. They're just in their perfectly normal state. They might be like, you know, from the First World War or something like that, and they're just perfectly fine, and they just rejoin the town. So there's that in that TV series, it's an ABC TV series. You know, that's a glitch. Like, things should die, but they haven't died. There's been a glitch. So that idea of a glitch, kind of interruption or malfunction in the code, if you like, of reality, is one way in which limits and the limits of representation are kind of given shape, given dramatic shape. So we see this in recent Anthropocene fiction. The one that sort of most obvious in this regard is Richard Flanagan's novel, A Living Sea of Waking Dreams, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams. And in that novel, there's various things happening, but I mean, particularly the mother is dying, and the children are kind of coping with that. The adult children are coping with the dying of the mother. There's also the things going on in the background are like, you know, the bushfires of a couple of years ago, and the extinction of animals, all the usual things really that we've become inured to, kind of continuous telemetry really of the Anthropocene. But in amongst that, the narrator, one day she looks down and she realizes she's missing a finger. And gradually she misses other parts of her body. And again, that a little bit like the bodies that rose out in the film, the TV series Glitch. It's not a bloodied stump, you know, which she has to bandage up. It's just, there was a finger there and now it's not there. And it's I think the way it's expressed in the novel is it's as though it's been photoshopped out. You know, it's kind of just not there, kind of blurry stump, as if it's some sort of optical effect rather than an actually missing finger. It's kind of compounded by the fact that no one mentions the fact that she's missing a finger, which is maybe forgivable, but later on she's missing a breast and then an eye, and you know, and it's still people don't mention it. So there's you have this idea of kind of a glitching, reality's glitching. We're not getting a kind of accurate mimetic reference point. Another thing, so the glitch, I think, is I guess what I'm doing today is really just positing a variety of symptoms for the Anthropocene and the Anthropocene fiction. Another one is dyschronia. So we kind of often think of Anthropocene fiction and climate fiction as dystopian, but again, I was quite impressed and influenced by Jennifer Mill's novel Dyschronia, just for the way that it kind of underscored how kind of the upsetting of time was the key effect of the Anthropocene, rather than what we think of as sort of a dystopian collapse. So a collapse of kind of historicity, you might say, or again, related to the earlier point, a glitching, but this time at the level of temporality or time. Dyschronia is also a feature of another important Australian Anthropocene novel, Alexis Wright's The Swan Book. And again, I think that's a novel which makes much more sense in terms of dyschronia than dystopia, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Mills acknowledges Wright's book as quite important in the way that she conceptualized her novel Dyschronia. As Daniel Fisher puts it, this is a description of the Swan Book. The Swan Book is a grand play with time itself, drawing together syntactic, narrative, and poetic features in a chronotope of temporal indeterminacy. So it's kind of hard to work out when we are at in the Swan Book. Like, it feels we're in a sort of a near future or a slightly distant future, or it also looks a lot and feels a lot like now, albeit in a slightly farcical register. And I think one of the interesting things, again, just thinking, putting dyschronia against dystopia. So the Swan Book does feature a collapsed world, and I think that's why it's often cast as dystopian fiction. But the collapse isn't really an event. There's not like a particular moment when things have happened, and we don't go through a certain slice history of the ecological collapse of the planet, like we get in, say, James Bradley's novel Clade. Instead, like, the moment of collapse is also like a moment of sort of terrible or terrifying or radical possibility. And I think in lots of ways that the book, the novel, follows a certain pattern that Eva Horn has termed catastrophe without event. So the catastrophe happens, but without a kind of singular enunciative moment. So we end up like in in a sort of, it's kind of a world of disarray, really, the world of the Swan book, like a shattered world, and a world that's really only apprehensible in glimpses. So that has kind of, there's a multiplication of partial sense or partial knowledge. We can't look the thing square in its eyes. Something preventing us. So whenever I encounter that sort of phenomenology or textual pattern, either in a film or a book, I tend to think of that as the epistemology of a primal scene. So we're looking at something that we're not supposed to be looking at, which is either foundational or obscene in some way or another. Or I guess, you know, in that sense, and particularly in as much as it's a certain profound or metaphysical kind of moment of creation, we can think of the novel as kind of a dreaming where the kind of world is being destroyed and remade in real time, and has some of the animistic components of dreaming stories. Another, and I think this is a particularly Australian literary response to the Anthropocene, have been novels of extinction and de-extinction. So as I mentioned at the outset, I think the novel that really inaugurates this moment within Australian literature is Julia Lee's novel, The Hunter, about well, you probably know the novel, but it's about the Tasmanian tiger, and in the novel, in the logic of the novel, or the premise of the novel, is that it still exists, and that an agent from a biotechnology company has been tasked with finding it and capturing its genetic information for some nefarious use, no doubt. So he goes out kind of undercover and tracks and hunts and finds that this thylacine still exists. It's not really stated, but one sort of feels that this is the last one. So there, he finds it. It's a woman. It's a female thylacine. He kills it and cuts out its ovaries and puts them in a little freezer and heads off with them. So that's how the novel sort of works. I mean, lots of other things going on in it as well. But it's a novel that's what stands out in the novel is the fact that there's two things happening. Like, one is, oh wow, the thylacine still exists. I mean, we thought the last one died in the 1930s or whatever, but it finally still exists. It's a kind of, the thylacine is, I guess, what's known as a ghost species, you know, like persistent sightings of an animal that's no longer with us. But then no sooner does it appear than it disappears. So we get a kind of close conjunction of uncanny appearance and uncanny disappearance. More recently, there are two novels, two Australian novels with the exact same premise, novels of de-extinction, which feature the reincarnation of Neanderthal human beings. So Donna Mazza's novel Fauna and James Bradley's Ghost Species both involve a woman giving birth to a human woman giving birth to a Neanderthal baby. The concept of extinction also has a particular valence that needs to be noted in relation to Indigenous writing. So this is a quote from near the start of Tara June Winch's The Yield. And in that novel, the protagonist is going back. Protagonist is a woman called August Gondawindi, and she's going back for the funeral of her grandfather. And she's on a plane, and she's given a newspaper, and she reads about an extinction. So again, it's very, very familiar, horrifically familiar experience for us these days. It's the sort of thing that's going on all the time in the background of Flanagan's novel. The rhino in the news reminded August that she'd never been to the zoo, never seen a rhino in real life. It might as well have been a dinosaur. The paper listed other recent extinctions. And just like that, she thought, zip, gone, Poppy. Albert Gondowindi was extinct. No more Albert Gondowindi roamed the earth, and no more black rhino either. So I guess what we see there is a direct identification really with through the Indigenous experience with the concept of extinction. And again, it's interesting. It's not there in any explicit way, but it works kind of extra-textually at the level of association in the Thylacine as well. So Thylacine novels, I guess the extinction of Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal people, as it was posited. I mean, there's thousands of people now, Aboriginal Tasmanians, but the idea of Aboriginal people going extinct and the reality of the Thylacine going extinct are kind of linked as well. So there's a kind of, again, an obscene connection there between extinction and Indigenous culture, which has a particular resonance for Indigenous Australians and Indigenous writers. I'll just say something a little bit more about the Indigenous Anthropocene, because again, it bears kind of a fuller discussion. And Tony Birch kind of wrote in a sort of fairly provocative essay that for Indigenous people, the impact of climate change is not a future event. It has occurred in the past and is occurring now. The way that Birch kind of puts it is that for Indigenous people, catastrophe is not an impending thing. We're not awaiting the climate catastrophe. We're not awaiting the disaster. It's something that has broken kind of fiercely across the world and vandalized every dimension of life and belief. In other words, for Aboriginal people, like, the end of the world is not something they have to imagine. They just have to remember it. So Birch is suspicious of dystopian eco-fiction, I think, for these sorts of reasons. He writes or asks, are these narratives of impending apocalypse something of a Western fetish? And do these stories lull people into thinking that a fictional future ravaged by climate change, by each of us actually, is nothing more than a disaster narrative produced for our entertainment? So there's some sort of tension there between the widespread decrying of the impending disaster and the widespread failure to make any change or effective intervention to prevent it. So it's the question of whether that's just mere impotence, at the level of our speech, we're not able to kind of, or whether the speech is in fact part of a kind of underhanded denial. Perhaps if we moan about it enough, we don't have to do anything, kind of thing like that. I think that's the gist of Birch's critique. The Willem and Nyunga writer Claire Coleman, her book Terra Nullius is kind of, in some ways, an ingenious illustration of Birch's point that the end of the world, which is imagined as dystopian fiction, has already happened for Indigenous people. So in that novel, at first it seems like we're in a historical novel describing the colonisation of Western Australia. So things that, in my neck of the woods are quite kind of common knowledge and part of really our critical history. So a mise-en-scène that's quite familiar to us from the plays of Jack Davis or Pilkington Garamara's Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence film adaptation, Kim Scott's novels. So the usual story, really, the colonial story, the settler colonial story. Land grabs by rapacious settlers, devastating introduced disease, loss of food and water. So all these things are depicted, again, almost catalogued in the novel in ways that I was sort of reading and thinking, okay, well, I've kind of heard this before. Enslavement of Indigenous people, emergence of a native protection system, stealing of children, all of these things happen one after the other, almost by numbers in the book. But then the twist that arrives is that we're not reading a recapitulation of the settler history of Western Australia, but the real-time description of the invasion of the planet Earth by aliens, these kind of amphibian humanoid invaders. I mean, who just happen, as it were, to do things exactly the way the British did in Western Australia. So it's a clever novel in that respect. And there's some transpositions of identity and identification that take place. So at the moment that it's kind of revealed, the big sort of reveal when we realize we're not in a historical novel, but in a sci-fi novel, you know, we suddenly go from being, like, for me as a white settler reader, I guess, I realized I was on the other side. I was a native now. I'd misidentified, I guess. So when the aliens are kind of revealed in Terra Nullius, it's an uncanny moment. The settlers who I thought were me are these kind of weird lizard creatures. So it's an uncanny moment. They have an uncanny quality. And this kind of relationship between the Anthropocene and the uncanny is something that a number of scholars have drawn attention to. Particularly, there was an issue of Australian Humanities Review by Stark, Schlunker, and Edmonds called "Uncanny Objects of the Anthropocene," literally saying that the unpeeling anthropocenic object not only occupies multiple ties but also diverse and contradictory discourses. I think they used the example of an iceberg, you know, which traditionally, you know, in common parlance had different associations, like the tip of the iceberg, like the idea that, you know, what we saw, there's much beneath it, or, you know, the iceberg that's floating out there, like the one that struck the Titanic, just a random unseeable accident waiting to happen, or kind of fatality. But today, the iceberg is kind of evidence of the crumbling of the ice caps and the melting of ice through the world, and changes in ocean levels and the whole thing, really. So something like an iceberg, which had a certain meaning and valence, now means something else, takes on an uncanny dimension as it acquires these new associations. And I think we can see these sort of, we can think of de-extinction, so like the Neanderthal babies, or as kind of, or the Thylacine itself as kind of uncanny objects in this sense. Here's a description from Bradley's novel Ghost Species, describing the Neanderthal girl. She is them but not them, human but not human, extinct yet somehow in this world. But most of all, she seems to embody a new kind of possibility, something both dizzying and terrifying to contemplate. Her presence in the world changing everything and nothing. Again, that's that sort of glitch, you know. Something's changed, but nothing's changed. There's a kind of incommensurability there, or some sort of yeah, it's a glitch. It shouldn't be there, but it's there. Everything's changed, but nothing's changed. Another useful text in this context is Ellen Van Even's novella Water, from the collection Heat and Light. Again, it's a decent amount of critical literature around that. It's a great book. It's a great story. In that one, it's kind of set in a near future, and the premise is that the Sand Islands of Moreton Bay are being kind of aggrandized and aggregated, and creating a new landmass called Australia 2, which is actually going to be a sort of homeland for Aboriginal people who aren't able to access the native title systems. So it's kind of utopian project, but as they start messing with these islands, these new creatures appear kind of strangely. They're kind of part plant, but they have the qualities of sentient beings. They have a language, they're able to move, and they're called sort of plant people. That the hero of that story that is kind of like an anthropologist, but like someone who's working as a liaison person with these new creatures and trying to protect them, I guess. Seeing them, the plant people, for the first time, I'm struck by how startlingly human-like they are and how alarmingly unhuman they are. So again, a similar sort of uncanny pivot point or oscillation around the idea of human, non-human. I think slightly more generally, we can see in a kind of object relations that characterises the Anthropocene in these kinds of texts. So we've got, and I think it follows more or less the dialectics of extinction, so extinction, de-extinction, or disappearance and appearance. So again, we think mainly in terms of extinction and disappearance. When we try to conceptualize the Anthropocene, and we imagine what all the things that are being lost. And again, we see that like in Julia Lee's The Hunter, that the loss of the thylacine, the kind of repetition of that moment in the present. In Flanagan's novel, the body parts that go missing as kind of glitches. In Jennifer Mills' Dyschronia, the ocean goes missing. So it's a seaside town. And then one morning, everyone wakes up and the sea is retreated beyond the horizon. So it's just an endless kind of flat ocean bed, kind of dying animals and seaweed just strewn across it. But kind of more, again, it probably needs a bit more of a data set than I've managed to sort of assemble for today. But I think more than the disappearance, what I'm tending to see is uncanny appearance, the appearance of uncanny objects. So touched on Mazza's and Bradley's Neanderthal babies, the plant people in Van Neerven's Water. In the swan books, the swans, they're not meant to be there. They're animals from further south. So they're out of place. In Dyschronia, the sort of uncanny objects are the cuttlefish, the giant cuttlefish. There's one giant one just appears in the town one day. I included the hunter in the appearance column as well as the disappearance column because both things happen. Like the thylacine appears after being extinct, supposedly, 60 years ago or 70 years ago, and then it disappears again. So it kind of flickers in and out of existence. And then I guess in Coleman's book, we have these amphibious aliens appearing. So we have this kind of oscillation of appearance and disappearance. And I think I suppose, or I posit really, hypothesize that is expressive of the dialectic of extinction, de-extinction. Another way of, again, probably putting this into, or conceptualizing this maybe, or another way of seeing how it's registered in these novels. This is to think in terms of a new signifier, so not necessarily just a new object, but a new signifier. So I guess we're moving from object relations to significations, a slightly different kind of ecology, really. In the Swan book, the appearance of the swan kind of heralds the advent of speech. So the heroine of that novel can't speak. She's kind of she's conditioned by her muteness, oblivia, and the Swan books is the appearance of the swan heralds the advent of a new kind of speech, speech that is going to be sort of generative or able to articulate the new reality. In Water, the creatures are the plant people, that is, they're teaching the humans a new language. Again, it's interesting in in terms of its indigeneity, because the plant, that there's a love story, basically, a kind of queer love story, and the protagonist falls in love with a plant person called Larapinta. So it's kind of like an Aboriginal name, and the language that they're speaking is kind of an old language. It's a bit like a dreaming language or an ancient kind of chthonic Aboriginal language. And in the sort of final image of that story, they're sort of waving, and the plant people are kind of waving, and they present as a kind of like a page of script, like a living script. The other novel that's kind of worth thinking about in terms of signification, I think, and language is Laura Jean McKay's novel, The Animals in That Country, where there's a flu, and that's a pandemic, basically, and people get sick. But the really striking symptom to emerge from this illness is that once you catch this flu, this virus, you're able to hear animals speak. So it's kind of colloquially known as zoo flu. And once you're infected, you can hear animals speak. And the interesting thing about the animals speaking is they don't kind of appear as kind of wise creatures who express the sort of dignity of nature and some sort of world of Gaia and wisdom. They speak in ways that are often kind of perplexing and incomprehensible. So there's a really interesting kind of poetics involved in McKay's novel, I think. But one way or another, they make themselves understood, the animals. So I think in each of these cases, there's one book, Van Neven's Water and McKay's The Animals in That Country, what we have is kind of the advent of signifiers which are natural signifiers, or I guess we could say the signifier of nature. Normally we sort of oppose those things. Kind of signifier is kind of a limit, basically. It's a kind of limit for nature, and a thing appears on the other side of that, which is culture or signification. But here, in these kinds of novels, what's imagined is nature itself signifying. So plant speech or animal speech. And I think this is positing a kind of ethics here, like as though, again, we're dealing with creative works and creative possibilities, and are thinking through, as though the only ethical solution to the Anthropocene is to hallucinate the speech of nature. So nature that's actually speaking. So that again, I think that's quite an interesting development. Yeah, quite a profound one, really. There are problems with that, but that's where thinkers and writers are going. All right, then I'll just quickly summarize, because I've covered a lot of territory and it's kind of gone in lots of different directions, slightly chaotically. So in Australian Anthropocene fiction, we've got the phenomenon of glitching, dyschronia, so a kind of a collapse in conventional temporality, maybe it's the telos of modernity, or but again, we don't have a, it's not, that's, the dyschronia isn't cast as sort of a 1990s kind of optimistic postmodernism, kind of triumph of micro-narratives and certain utopian counter-discursive space. You know, the dyschronia is actually quite cataclysmic and quite traumatic, but it's also generative. We've got the crucial dimension within Australia of a settler context, and the intersection really of the kind of cataclysmic destruction of settler invasion, both culturally and ecologically, with now the planetary crisis. We have uncanny objects, so things appearing where they shouldn't be, and that relationship of appearance, disappearance, and uncanniness is expressive or keyed to the dialectics of extinction, that the fact of a species going missing is something that linguistically and socially and kind of metaphysically, it's hard to countenance and kind of cope with. And then lastly, again, a sort of tantalizing possibility, and again, needs a bit more work, but idea of a new signifier sort of appearing, and nature as a kind of radical possibility. But I mean, one of the great things about McKay's book is that the fact that the fact that we can't understand the animals fully, but we can a little bit, is what is the signature of them as authentic speaking subjects. Like if we fully understood them, clearly it would just be a fantasy that's coming directly from us. When you fully understand something, it's because you already knew it. But these this slightly foreclosed dimension to the animals who are speaking in McKay's book actually dignifies them as proper subjects. So again, like there's lots of people with takes on Anthropocene fiction, Australian Anthropocene fiction. I'm really just joining my voice to it's a pretty loud chorus, but hopefully these are some ideas which you know, can be tested a little bit more thoroughly and made to tie in with other ideas that are kind of consonant with it, or put against the ideas that it seems that my ideas seem to conflict with. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, terrific. Thanks so much, Tony, for an exhilarating mapping of what's going on, and so much is going on obviously in this space in Australian Lit and elsewhere, and in the critical space too. So that was just a really exciting kind of sweep, and you know, yeah, really great, very exciting. So I'm sure we've got lots of questions. Is there any question immediately? I can see Anne. Anne, you go.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I really loved the paper, and having just read through all the kind of entries for the VOS, I was really struck by this kind of subgenre that was coming through with the de-extinction, and you know, just so interesting to see the sort of like you know, similar idea with fauna and ghost species, but done completely differently. One of the other entries that kind of fits into that de-extinction was Chris Flynn's Mammoth, which is about, you know, again, the nature beginning to speak, but it's beginning to speak before it comes to life as well. And the end of the book is the sort of like possibility of it then sort of like, you know, sort of being cloned and brought back to life in the same way, similar way as in ghost species. But my question is that with the Mazza and the Bradley books, it's very much done within that idea of the uncanny and the idea of the Gothic in some respects, whereas Flynn's book uses satire. And I was wondering if you, I hadn't read some of the others like McKay, but I was wondering if you had any sense of, again, the sort of like genre distinctions, which maps onto what you were saying about the steering away from the full fantasy and the idea of entertainment, and also that satire's got quite a different kind of function to Gothic. So I just, anyway, any thoughts? That was sort of like what was going through my head.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't dwell at all. I mean, my paper was quite blind to that dimension of literary expression, which I tend to regard as register. Or, but yeah, I think the satire. I mean, yeah, the book Mammoth by Chris Flynn. I mean, the book that it brought. When I read that, what it brought to my mind was Vonnegut's Galapagos. It's that kind of book where there's a kind of the dead is speaking in a slightly wry way, looking down at the kind of absurd comedy of life, really, and the vanity of people. But yeah, I thought it was not, again, like you see that sometimes with sort of back from the dead or angel type narrators like Desperate Housewives, you know, sort of something like that, you know, where someone's, but in that novel, you're right, it kind of tried to be evocative of deep time, really, and kind of speak out of that. I think that Alexis Wright's also a comedic writer in that sense. Like, again, it's a pretty dry comedy, I guess. Like, there's a bitterness and a kind of, I mean, the comedy is suggestive of the balefulness of the situation, you know. So yeah, I think there are I think you're right. There are different. There's quite a spectrum, really. Like, so you have like comedy or satire, what Van Neerven calls Aboriginal realism, when she talks about Winch, maybe. Then you've got kind of a queer love story in a slightly Le Guin sort of manner for Van Neerven herself. Kind of blank parody with Coleman, and then yeah, kind of gothic dimensions in some of those other novels. So yeah, I guess I was trying to cut through that for this particular purpose, maybe, and to look at some more of the structural phonological elements. But I think I'm not sure. Yeah, there isn't. I think the Anthropocene is kind of a challenge to register. Certainly, it doesn't seem to be capable of tragedy. That's the one thing that sort of yeah, and I think that's bad. That's a bad thing. That's a sign of how bad it is.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Yeah, I kind of just thought it was interesting that there was so many. I like the idea of you bringing up the absurdism as well. It really seems appropriate framework as well. But yeah, thanks. I'll leave it for others.
Thanks, Anne. Anyone else have a question for Tony? Tony, I might jump in there. And I wondered what you might think about the idea of, you know, response. So the limit. I mean, a lot of what you unpacked was obviously what the limit might mean in these texts. But I mean, do you think that and you seem to be suggesting this at the end, I think that they are also moving towards an understanding of what the limit means in terms of a response to climate change, that, you know, that Australian literary fiction is advocating something here. And if you do, what do you think that might be?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Yeah, and quite often, I mean, it's interesting, like when you contrast, say, Wright, the novelist, with Wright, the public intellectual, you get quite different, a different image, really. So I didn't find, I guess the text that I'm looking at, they're not developing a kind of coherent political response, I don't think. I'm not sure if they're advocating one. I feel like they're doing they're working on kind of conditions prior to that, really. Sort of the kind of turmoil at the imaginary level, where there's not even a footing for political action. I feel that's where they're kind of located. But I mean, I think, you know, if you ask all of these writers or Jennifer Mills, they would all be wanting change. They'd be supporting Greta Thunberg. You know, it's just. But when and this is what the dimension of fiction, I guess, kind of allows. It's that the yeah, it allows us maybe to try and think through what the actual orientation would be that from which a politics would proceed. So yeah, I think it's probably at that limit. So I think we've reached I think there's a widespread feeling maybe that we've reached the limits of our politics, you know. So I think that's what you're kind of asking, Emily, like where are the barricades which we can join? Like in which streets are they? Like where's the grounds in which political action can actually find purchase? So I feel that's probably what these texts are kind of grasping for, new coordinates in which politics can actually make. And I do feel that there, I mean, this may be utopian on my part, but I do feel like that is necessary sometimes, and it can be quite dispiriting because you look around you and politics is not working. But I think it's probably because the politics are inadequate to the task and to the situation, and the work of understanding where we are has to come first. And I just dearly hope that from that, an effective politics can emerge.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I hope that's so too. But I think that, you know, idea of understanding where we are is critical, and a lot of the discourse around, you know, messaging on climate is too far, you know, it's forward facing. It doesn't want to, you know, it doesn't have time for that work. And there's that, you know, there's one reason of that is there's such urgency, but also it maybe doesn't consider that work's needed, you know. So I like what you're saying, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I haven't expressed it very well, but yeah, I mean, it's funny. I just taught some honours students, and it was, you know, I was teaching with my colleagues Tanya and Kieran, and I had like a third of the semester, and we just did. I think we did the Living Sea of Waking Dreams, water, and the animals in that country. A kind of little mini module on this for Australian literary studies, and they're a really good group, you know, smart, switched on, engaged. But they'd also like one of the kind of criteria that I'd apply to each text was like its degree of hope, you know, like that seemed to be like something that they would like, well, that was kind of hopeful, but not too hopeful, you know, like that would sort of. So again, I think there's something around what hope means, and I also do wonder whether hope, because it always gets kind of raised, like, oh, well, that's a very pessimistic account. We need to hope. Hope is the only thing. But again, I feel like there's a sort of poverty around our idea of hope, and that the kind of hope that emerges, say, in Alexis Wright is a deeper sourced and more complex form of hope. And I feel like we might need to explore that idea a little bit more fully.
Someone's playing ukulele in the background here, just in case you can hear it. Are there any other questions to go along with the ukulele playing?
I think I have more of a comment than a question, but I'm just wondering in the various tropes that you've outlined, it seems like, you know, and maybe the dialectic of extinction and de-extinction is just another form of this, of things being obliterated or seen, or obliterated or heard, because it seems that in each of those kind of tropes that you're identifying, the issue that the protagonist and that the reader is encountering is between something that they didn't see that was there all along, or something that was unseen that returned, or something that we're refusing to see or no one else can see or hear, in the case of something like Laura Jean McKay's book. So I'm wondering if that just runs through all of it, and that potentially some of these tropes are about, grappling with representation at that level of what can I see, what can't I see, what might I be able to see if only, and then.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's you know, and it goes to the question of limit. So if you know, if we're entering, as we often say, a sort of uncharted territory, we're faced with genuine or radical novelty. You know, things that are new. But oddly enough, and maybe necessarily, like the way we apprehend them is through things we do know. You know, but I mean, the structure of the uncanny is in the Freudian articulation is like things that we once knew, which we now no longer know, or we no longer give credence to, which suddenly reappear in a way that casts doubt on their subordination. You know, like so. Yeah, ghosts, for instance. You know, like we used to. A ghost is a kind of a revenant, a thing that comes back. So it's odd that you're having a ghost, and in this case, the ghost of an extinct species, for instance, announcing that. So something from the past that's gone, announcing the fact they're entering a new and completely uncharted territory. So there's an interesting kind of paradox there that, you know, at the limit point, where we're supposedly entering a completely novel situation, novel climatic patterns or whatever, the announcement of that is like, you know, like we need some sort of guide from the past to announce that. A bit like, you know, Dante needed Virgil or something like that. And in terms of, hang on. In terms of, again, like Alexis Wright's indigenous cosmology, again, I find that's interesting because, like, you know, in the kind of Gulf country, which is a place of radical, at the geographic level, it gets rewritten quite frequently. You know, the rivers change course, things get inundated, swept away, restart. But the ontology of the people is that the spirits are still there. So there's, and again, I'm not sure if that is, I'm attracted to that. I'm not sure if that's where we end up going in terms of navigating the future, you know, into some sort of ancientness. Certainly there's been a return to animism and in some ways this like giving plants and animals voices is a form of animism, and so again, it's quite possible that although we entering uncharted territory, what we reach for is actually things which we've previously thrown away, you know, like myth or animism, or, you know, sort of pre-capitalist modernity, basically.
Good point, Tony. Tony had mentioned to me that he can stay on for a little bit after 2. So if there are any further questions anyone would like to ask before we wrap up. Zahida had a comment in the chat for you there, Tony, I think.
Did you want to say something about that, Zahida? Okay. Yeah, it sounds good. I think oh, you're outside. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I don't think I know that book. Does anyone else know this book?
No.
I'll have to look it up. But yeah, I mean, again, it's not, we don't have to go far in some ways to look for texts that have talking animals. I mean, most children's literature kind of rolls around that concept. So again, like it's there, but it doesn't belong within hegemonic reality. You know? Yeah, and again, like McKay's book is quite good because it's kind of conscious of that, because, you know, that I really like the sort of heroine of that novel. It's kind of foul-mouthed, kind of middle-aged woman, and she doesn't kind of subscribe to niceties, and she's a keeper at a kind of zoo that looks sounds a bit like Steve Irwin's zoo or whatever, and she just shamelessly anthropomorphizes the animals. She keeps getting told off for that, like it's not good to treat them like humans. You know, you're projecting and all sort of thing. And again, like I get that, but what's so bad about that? Like, you know, it's an interesting problem within kind of eco-criticism, really. Like, to what extent we hold kind of in a puritanical, deeper ecological way to the fundamental otherness of animals and a position of kind of pure deference to their otherness, such that they remain mute, or do we impute language to them? And again, I think McKay does something really interesting there by imputing a language. So instead of rendering them silent or getting them to speak just like us, she gets them to speak in a way that's not quite comprehensible. So she realizes at some level that for them to have a kind of existence, they need to have a languaged existence, but she registers the fact of their non-language in the glitching of their language. So yeah, I thought that was a really, you know, interesting and bold and quite, yeah. I mean, my students really like that book as well. I thought that was a new direction for me.
Yeah, I love that book too. Have you read, I should let you go, sorry, I should let everyone go. Have you read Summertime by Danielle Sellermayer?
No.
Which is a non-fiction book that she wrote. Has anyone else here read it? In the wake of the bushfires, of 2019 bushfires. And she's a philosopher at Sydney Uni, but it's written in a very, you wouldn't know she's a philosopher kind of way. And it's autobiographical account of her experiencing those fires, but she has a property somewhere in New South Wales with lots of rescue animals. And so it starts out learning that she lost some of these animals in the fire, and she explores basically the horror and the suffering that those animals must have experienced, plus the billions of others that she didn't know. But she goes to these places, which it reminded me of that, Tony, because there has been this sort of, you know, this kind of disciplining of humans, human writers in relation to animals. You know, you can't speak for them, you can't pretend to know them. They're that, you know, the other, you know, the unknowable other kind of thing. And she goes somewhere else, and it's that Levinasian thing where she asks us to look at, you know, look at the face of the animal, look in the eyes. And she just goes to these other places of relationality, which is a very, very effective and powerful. And you kind of think, well, this is sort of where we do need to be going, because if you do have this mute animal that you can't, you feel like there's this, you know, unbridgeable divide between you and it. How can you ever feel impelled to change your behaviours to privilege their life? You know, it's really, I recommend it. It's a great book.
Was it called Summer of Fire?
And no, it's called Summertime.
Summertime. Okay.
Yeah, hang on, I'll put it in the chat. By
Danielle.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, it'll make you cry in a good way. Well, maybe in a bad way, actually. Yeah, it's a small little book, but it's beautiful.
Okay, I'll definitely check that out. Sounds great.
Well, thank you, Tony. Unless there's anything else anyone's desperate to say, but it was great to have you with us and great to have a chat.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for listening to me.